Welcome everyone to another episode of the JPN podcast. Thank you so much for joining. For those who were able to make it to the live recording, today we're lucky to have Rabbi Steinmetz, who's the rabbi of Tallis of the Albert Einstein College of Medicine Synagogue. He's lectured widely on topics of medical halacha. In fact, not too long ago, we were lucky enough to have Rabbi Steinmetz come and give us share on Hanukkah and how to navigate lighting, different zmanim. With our rigorous schedule in the hospital, it can be quite difficult. It's actually a wonderful share that I highly recommend everyone go take a listen to. And today we're lucky enough to have him back again to discuss the matter of davening while navigating your hospital schedule, which can be quite demanding. We're often in the hospital before the Zman Tefillah. We're there for extended periods of time. It's very rare we have a moment free. So we're lucky to have Rabbi Steinmetz come talk to us today about how to navigate this issue. So without further ado, thank you so much for your time. And Rabbi Steinmetz, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me again. Again, I appreciate what is being done here, and I appreciate and hopefully, this will only be a very positive experience in general. I appreciate the organization and everything it stands for, as I mentioned last time. So we're going to discuss the topic as, the title suggests. I didn't figure out the title this week nor last week. They're way too clever for me. But the title was Scalpels and Siddurim, Navigating Davening Times in the Clinical Setting. And the idea is that we're going to try to discuss, again, probably not all of the issues, but many of the issues that arise in specifically davening times, that problems with davening times when you're going to a hospital. Now, just a few, I guess, introductory remarks. Firstly, this topic, as many probably are aware of, isn't purely a medical topic. Obviously, from a medicine standpoint, it's not a medical topic at all. But this topic obviously can be kind of taken to other aspects, other jobs. If you're working a job in corporate law and you have to get into your job at 4 in the morning, obviously you would have the same questions. Nevertheless, we are specifically going to discuss it in terms of people working in, healthcare, and more specifically in a hospital, in a clinical setting, having to get there early. So I would suggest not extrapolating anything we say in this discussion to any other job, although one may be able to extrapolate, but it is not so clear. Where we're really going to focus, as we generally do, specifically on those that are, again, in a clinical setting. Secondly, each question really is going to be different. So I've gotten many questions over the last couple of years about these topics, times when they can daven, how they can daven, etc., etc. But each kind of needs to be taken, number one, at face value, but also with all the nuances that each, hospital kind of presents itself. Each person is going to be different in how they deal with tefillah. So there could be, detailed answers that are specifically catered to each person asking. We are obviously going to talk about it in a more general sense. On that note, it is obviously very significant that a person figures out their own schedule, whether that be in a hospital or anywhere else. But figuring out, exactly what can and cannot be done in terms of their tefillah, how much can they take off if they are in a hospital in the morning, depending on, if they're at this point, even if you're a medical school student, obviously, and you're on rotations, you're going to have the same questions, not just residents, not just, attendings or fellows. All these people are going to have these type of questions, and you really have to figure out your schedule. We aren't going to get to everything, as I mentioned before. We're probably not going to end up discussing Mincha and Mariv. I don't know. I'm going to try, just depending on time. I don't know if we're going to end up talking about tallis and tefillin. We're going to focus a little more on the tefillah. If we have time at the end, we will discuss tallis and tefillin as well. But specifically the tefillah. Another thing that we are not going to talk about is how we get to specific times. So we know there are specific times that we're going to keep on bringing up. There's Alos HaShachar, there is Misha Yakir, there is Netzach Hama. So those are all, again, dawn, Misha Yakir is a middle time, and then Netzach Hama is what we call sunrise. All these things are different times, and obviously they're very, very significant in terms of Echos Tefillah, but we're not going to figure out how you get there. That's a totally separate discussion. My assumption is everyone's going to log on to their Zmanim app or go on My Zmanim or whatever. And when it says alos, that's the time we're assuming, or nates or mishayaki or whatever it is. But we're not going to figure out exactly how to get that. That's a separate discussion. So the assumption is whatever those times are, those are the fixed times that we're going to be using.
And just to
One
clarify,
last,
you just mean how to calculate those times.
correct, in terms of calculation, correct. Meaning how many degrees is it actually to calculate when sunrise is, when dawn and dusk are, when all these things, that we're going to leave that aside for this discussion. Thank you. And the last, just an introductory remark, and the reason why this is a very, very significant discussion is because throughout the discussion, we're going to deal with things that are lechatchila and things that are b'diavad. And that's the most important thing to realize. There are plenty of things that are b'diavad, but obviously, as Torah observant Jews, we want to do things in the most lechatchila fashion, in the most lechatchila way. And that's what we're going to try to get. Oftentimes, it's just impossible, and we can't do it. But it's important to understand what is lechatchila, what is b'diavad, so that even though at times when we do things that are b'diavad, we don't always do that. And when we have the ability, we're always going to switch it back to the lechatchila mode, as it were. So those are just very, very important things. Okay, so we're going to begin discussing Kriya Shema. I just can't see because everyone's faces are in the way. Okay, there we go. So we're going to discuss Halchos Kriya Shema. So the Mishnah really already tells us, the Gemara tells us, and Brachos on Tes Amud Beis I have Me'em Asai Kornis Shema B'Shachris. When do we recite Kriya Shema Mishayakir Ben Tchelas to Lavan? When a person can distinguish between Tchelas and Lavan. The Gemara then goes on a long discussion with different Amoraim, giving us different opinions as to what exactly this time period is. It doesn't say what a time period is, but there are different examples. Mishayakir being X to Y, when a person can recognize the difference between X and Y, whatever it is. Achirim come and say it's Mishayakir when a person can recognize or can see their friend Daled Amos, 4 Amos away. So what exactly is that? So there's a big discussion, but in very short, the Shulchan Aruch paskins, which we'll see in the next slide, with the Shulchan Aruch paskins in Siman Nun Ches and Sif Aleph, what that basically means is if you have a friend that you are familiar with, it's not your family member that you see every day, but it's not someone you never see, someone who you're familiar with. When you can see him Daled Amos away, that's this period of Mishayakir, and the Gemara tells us this is this period that you are chayav to recite Kriya Shema. Your mitzvah's Kriya Shema begins at that point. Wonderful. Seems to be, we have a simple answer. When do we recite Kriya Shema? At this time period called, that we're going to refer to as Mishayakir. The problem is, the Gemara later on Tes Amud Beis tells us, in the next source, you can read it, it seems to say that one is supposed to recite Shema right next to Vasikin, which we're just going to assume is sunrise. So right before sunrise, which is a period after Mishayakir, that seems to be the time that we're supposed to recite Kriya Shema. Yira'ucha im shemesh v'lifnei yerech dor dorim. The pasuk tells us, as the Gemara quotes the pasuk, that this is Yira'ucha im shemesh, with the sunrise. That's when you're supposed to, again, say Shemona Esrei, as we'll get to in a few minutes, Bli neder mirza Hashem. But more importantly for us, right before then, that's when you're supposed to recite Kriya Shema. So this seems to be a later time period. So all the Rishonim explain, no, really, the mitzvah min hamuvchar, the ideal time to recite Kriya Shema is, again, right before Nitzach Chama, right before sunrise. Nevertheless, you can still recite it earlier, Mishayakir, at that time period when you can recognize your friend, a familiar face 4 amos away from you. So again, ideally, nates, but a little before is also okay. It's just not called the ideal time. Now, the Rambam in Hilchos Kriya Shema, in the first parak, in the 12th halacha, tells us, amongst all the other Rishonim also, that right now we have 2 time periods. We say ideally nates, ideally sunrise, and if not, so if you do it after Mishayakir, it's also fine. The Rambam then comes and tells us that b'shas atchak, in a pressing situation, one can even recite it from alos, the earliest time period of the day. Let's just quote it. That point called alos hashachar, amud hashachar, that would be the earliest time period that one can recite the Kriya Shema. But again, that is only b'shas atchak. That is only at a time when there's a pressing situation. So if you look in the Shulchan Aruch here, Nun Ches Sef Aleph, I brought it down. Again, this is all it says. Zman Kriya Shema shel shachris, mishayiras chaver ragil imok tzas b'richuk daled amos Renu. You recognize a familiar face 4 amos away until Gimel Shaos. The mitzvah min hamufchar, the ideal time is kivasikin, what we would call sunrise. Good. As we just pointed out, the Rambam tells us, however, b'shas adchat, you can even do from alos hashachar, from amud hashachar, which is an earlier time period. Now, the question is, what is considered a pressing situation? What is considered a shas hadchak? So the Rambam, again, in that Rambam, Perek Aleph Halacha Yud Beis writes, Kegon, shayamashkim latzis laderech, that you wake up to go travel. You have an early day at work, so you're waking up very early, and you're going to have to go and travel. Again, back then, it wasn't going to take a train, but he had to travel somewhere. He wasn't going to have the ability to say Kriya Shema. So that's called a Shas Adchak for the Rambam, that you can recite it even from the Amud HaShachar, even from Alos HaShachar, the earliest time period. That's one extreme. Similar to that, Rabbi Yonah, I put also, it's at the end of this slide, Rabbi Yonah, Brachos on Daf Beis Amud Beis in the Daf Arif tells us that Ratzolomer Shemashkim Latzeis Laderech, that the person, it's not just that he's going to wake up early for work. The Rabbi Yonah says it's more than just, the Rambam says waking up early for work. Rabbi Yonah says when a Shas Adchak isn't just that you have an early work day, but it's that you're traveling with a lot of other people, and you know if you don't leave by 5:30, your bus is going to leave, your shuttle is going to leave, so you're going to be stranded. That's called the Shas Adchak. That's what Rabbi Yonah says. The Rashba goes to even more of an extreme, and the Rashba says a Shas Adchak is shehishkim latzeis laderech. Again, in the second source here, it's the Rashba and Brachos on Chesam and Beis, that a person wakes up early in the morning, b'makom gdudei chayiv v'listim, shlo yuchal la'amod, v'lo lechavin afilu l'parsha rishona. The Rashba says what's called a pressing situation. It's if you're put in a dangerous situation. So you wake up very early. If you don't say Shema now, you're going to be in a situation where you're going to be you're going to be in a dangerous situation. As you're going, when you're in the ideal time, again, after, whether it's Misha Yakir or after Nates, but at that point, it's going to be very dangerous. It's going to be a Gdudei Chayiv V'listim. There are going to be robbers there and wild animals. You're not going to be able to recite Shema. So that's the only time where we say, because you're not able to recite Shema because of the danger, because of it's just going to be too much for you. You're not going to be able to have any kavanah at all. So the Rashba says, therefore, that's the only time period that you would be allowed to say Shema before Misha Yakir, again, right after Alos, that beginning period of the day. So again, we have 3 explanations as to what Shas Adchak means by Kriya Shema. Again, ideally you recite Kriya Shema with Vasikin, with sunrise. If not, it's totally okay to recite after Misha Yakir. If it's a Shas Adchak, you can even recite it from Alos. What's a Shas Adchak? Either it just means that you're going to be traveling early, or it means you're going to be traveling early and the people you're traveling with are going to leave you, are going to, not going to wait for you, or whatever that is. And number 3 is that the way that the Rashba has it is that you're going to be put in a dangerous situation. That's the 3rd. Okay. So what's the halacha? The Shulchan Aruch writes, again, in Unches and Siv Gimel, that Mishu Anos, Kigon Shayamashkim Latzeis Laderech B'mkom Gidudei Chayiv V'listim. No, he's going to be in a situation like the Rashba says. It's going to be dangerous. He's not going to be able to have any kavana, because as he's traveling, when the proper time hits, he's going to be in the jungle. He's going to be in a very, very dangerous situation. He's not going to be able to have the mental fortitude to have kavana to recite Kriya Shema. Or that was the Rashba. Or B is that if he waits for the proper time, so his caravan, or in our situation, his shuttle, is going to leave, and he's not going to be able to recite. Both of those situations, a person is able to recite Shema already from Alos HaShachar, from the earliest time period of the day. He does not quote the Shas Adchak of the Rambam, meaning just because a person wakes up early and has to go to work early does not mean he's allowed to say Shema that early. It's only when the people who he's going with are going to leave without him, or he's going to be put in a dangerous situation. So that's again how the Shulchan Aruch seems to paskin. Now, practically for us, what does that mean? A person is going to the hospital very, very early. He has to get there very early. So does that mean that, what kind of Shas Adchak is that? Is he allowed to recite Shema at Alos HaShachar, or does he have to wait till later in the day? Later in the day, he may not, again, he may just be so busy, and he may miss the time. It may be after the Gimel Shas, whenever he's able to, when he has to stop saying Kriya Shema.
So I was
So
wondering, would it matter whether the person has access to private transportation versus only public transportation? They have their own
it's
car versus
yeah,
someone
it's
is
very possible. So again, what your question assumes is that while you're on the transportation, maybe the zman will hit, right? Meaning, let's
right.
say you have, Alos is 5 o'clock. Your shuttle, let's just say, is leaving at 5:15. Mishayakir is 5:30. I'm just giving random numbers. Mishayakir is 5:30. 6
Right.
o'clock is Nate's. So what you're saying is when you're in the shuttle, it'll be the right time. So you could daven. So let's say it's not a shuttle. Let's say it's your private car. So presumably both a shuttle and a private car, a person can sit down and have kavana to daven, right? Because he's sitting anyway. Even if it's public, he can close his eyes and say a paragraph of Shema. Presumably, I'm not saying the
Not
subway may
when
be a little
someone's
more
driving.
difficult. What?
If you're the one driving, you're not going to close your
Yeah, so
eyes
that would
and
be the difficult. But even if you're not driving, if you're taking a public bus off and you're crowded and you're standing and with a
right.
bunch of other people,
Yeah.
so that can also. But if you're driving, yeah, and you wouldn't be able to say Shema. So the
Right.
question is though, if you're driving, when you park, do you have 30 seconds
Right.
to a minute? Okay, so that's something a person has to figure out. That's a
Yeah.
specific situation. But presumably this would still be many of the poskim. Rav Shachter has told this to me that so if you're going in specifically for pikuach nefesh, you're a doctor, you're trying to help patients. So that is called a shasat chak enough that if you have no other option, again, what you're asking, you may have another option, but if you had no other option, you would be allowed to recite Kriya Shema already from Alos HaShachar. Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva also like this in Orach Chaim Chelik Dalid, where again he writes, if there's no other option, you would have the ability to say Kriya Shema already from Alos HaShachar. Again, as you pointed out, this would be a case-specific situation, and each person kind of has to figure out how their transportation works, how much time they actually have, how much time do they want to have. Those are very, very important questions, but those are some of the basic dinim. Now, what about the birchos Kriya Shema? We talked about Kriya Shema, but are you allowed to, we said b'shas adchak, you're allowed to say before alos. Kriya Shema itself, the zman really starts at Mishayakir. Ideally, Nates, but Mishayakir is the zman. What about the birchos Kriya Shema, that which we say with Kriya Shema, starting from the bracha of Yotzer or. So if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, so he writes, again, I put it in, the Kivan She'ala, the third to last line in the Shulchan Aruch, the Kivan She'ala Amud HaShachar, Shapir Karina Beiv Kumecha, V'gam Shapir Mikra Yotzer Or. It's already called Yotzer Or from Amud HaShachar. So the Magen Avram, again, I put in Sif Katan Hey, he quotes that this is the opinion of some, but others say, no, you need Misha Yakir. It can't be earlier than Misha Yakir. This is the opinion of the Magen Avram. Nevertheless, the Bir Halacha in this Siman, and the Mishnah Berurah quotes it a little bit, also writes that no, again, B'shas Chak, just like B'shas Chak, one is allowed, if there's no other option, one can say Shema already from Alos HaShachar, the earliest time period. So too, when it comes to the Berchos Kriya Shema B'shas Chak, the Bir Halacha says one can recite already from Alos HaShachar. And again, this is Rav Shachter did pass into me in one situation. So those would all be dinim, again, in regards to Kriyas Shema. Now, what about the halachos of Shmona Esrei? So this has many differences, but we'll just start from the beginning. So the Gemara in Brachos on Daf Chavav Amud Aleph tells us that mitzvah samnei tzachama, that the mitzvah of of Shmona Esrei is meant to be said with sunrise. That is the time for the mitzvah of Shmona Esrei. Now the Rishonim all point out, Tosas on Daf Lamed in Brachos, but all the Rishonim, the Rambam, the third parak of Hilchos Tefillah, the Rosh, they all point out that really, even though you're supposed to daven with nates, that's really what Tosfos term as the Iker Zman Tefillah. That's the ideal time. But if you need to, you can start even before, or you can daven even beforehand. And that's what the Shulchan Aruch here writes in Siman Pei Tesif Aleph, that man Tfilas HaShachar mitzvah sheyaschel im hanetz hachama. That's the mitzvah. But im ispalo misha'ala amud HaShachar yatza. But your yotze, it's totally okay if you daven Shmona Esrei already from Alos. So says the Atar Zkanim, which I put here, one of the Nosei Kalim on the Shulchan Aruch, that Hainu b'diavad b'shas adchak, your yotze, if a person davens Shmona Esrei from Alos HaShachar, your yotze, but your yotze a b'diavad, meaning it's not ideal, and b'shas adchak, said, I put in parentheses that those are my words, but the Atar Zkanim does point out, if you daven from Mishayakir, again, that time period between Alos and Eitz, so you're ideally supposed to daven from Nates. If you daven Mishayakir, that's fine. Even again, it's mutter to, you should ideally daven in eitz, but it's mutter to from Misha Yakir. But if you daven after alos, Ataris Kenim says b'diavad, that's okay, but only b'shas adchak. The Mishnah Berurah disagrees, and this is how we hold. Mishnah Berurah writes in Sifkan Dalid that b'shas adchak, so in that case, you would be yotze if you davened alos, but it was from alos, but that's not b'diavad, that's l'chatchila, meaning, if a person is davening Shemona Esrei, so he's supposed to daven from nates, from sunrise. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if he davens from alos, he's yotze b'diavad. But if he davened from alos because there was a shas adchak, because there was some pressing situation, that's considered a lechatchila. There's nothing else for him to do. It's not as if he davened a b'diavad davening. And that's an important thing for us to understand. Now, the other thing that's important is that it seems to be that in this case, put in the next source, b'shas adchak, in Siman Pei Tes Sif Ches. What's a pressing situation when it comes to Shemona Esrei? Kigon shetzarich lahashkin maderech. He's waking up early for work. So yachol espal mishalam and ashachar, etc., etc. So says the Shulchan Aruch, if you're waking up early and you're pressing situation, what are you going to do? You have to go to work very early. So you're able to daven Shemona Esrei from alos. So in this case, if people remember, the Shas Adchak here is defined differently than by Kriya Shema. Here again, Shas Adchak kigon shetzarich lahashkin maderech. He has to wake up early because he has to go to work early. If you remember back by Hilchos Kriya Shema, I'll try to. Mishu onus kigon sheyamashkim matzis aderech b'malkom gedudei chayiv v'listim, etc., etc. It was a much more extreme pressing situation. It wasn't just he was waking up early, but it was much more than that. It was he was waking up early and it was a dangerous situation, or the shuttle that he was going to go with, his only ride was leaving without him. Right? It wasn't just he had to go to work early, but here it's just he had to go to work early. So what exactly is the difference? Obviously there is a difference. So there's a Gemara in Brachos on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, which asks the following question: what is better, davening standing with concentration before the Zman, or to be somech geula litfila, but while sitting, not with such concentration? So basically, it's our very situation. Let's say a person has to go to work at 4:30. Let's just say Mishiyakir is 4:45. So it's after alos. So he has two options. He can daven Shemona Esrei now after alos, and then say Kriya Shema once Mishiyakir hits. Once he either gets to the hospital or he's in the car, or whatever it is. But he can daven a good Shemona Esrei now while standing, or he waits, and when he's on the shuttle and he's all whatever, he quickly has he says Shema and Shemona Esrei quickly while sitting. He doesn't really have concentration. What's better? Asks the Gemara. So it's a machlokas in the Amoraim. The Gemara says it depends on the machlokas in the Amoraim. But the Shulchan Aruch here paskins, again, in Pei Tes Sif Ches, it's better to have concentration to daven by yourself with what we call Yishav Hadas, standing after alos, and then later you'll daven Shema at the right time. But it's better this way than davening, being somech geula tefillah. Again, is to daven Shema and the brachos right before Shemona Esrei. But if you're gonna have to do that in a way where you're sitting and you're going really fast because you're on your way to work, whatever it is, so it's better to daven peacefully before this Zman, meaning after alos Shemona Esrei, and then you'll daven Shema later on. So says the Shulchan Aruch. What's the difference? So the Rashba explains the following: when it comes to tefillah, so we're maker because the ikar of tefillah, the main point of tefillah, is to daven me'umad bekavana, is to daven standing with proper kavana, with proper intent. That's how one is supposed to say their tefillah. That is how one is supposed to daven Shemona Esrei, as opposed to Kriya Shema, where you don't really need anything but the first pasuk. The first pasuk is the mitzvah. So a person can again spend 20 seconds at most to say with concentration the pasuk of Shema and even ve'ahavta, and be able to be yotze his chiyuv. Shemona Esrei is a lot longer. So says the Rashba that's the difference. For a shas adchak, a pressing situation, so when it comes to Kriya Shema, we have a much higher bar, because what we're going to say is wait till a little later. You're going to tell me you're in this pressing situation. You're not going to be able to until whatever it is. You have to go to work. What are you going to do? Okay, so spend 20 seconds with concentration, say Shema. Not such a big deal. You can do that. When it comes to Shemona Esrei, though, it's about spending 5 minutes. Is not the same time as 20 seconds. So says the Rashba, that's why there's a different bar for what's considered a shas adchak by Shmona Esrei than by Kriya Shema. By Kriya Shema, we have a much higher bar because Kriya Shema, you only need that kavana for a pasuk, or maybe a little more. But by Shmona Esrei, you need kavana for the whole Shmona Esrei, and therefore the bar is much lower. And as long as you're going to be traveling and you're not going to get a good tefillah, we'll say no, it's better to daven the entire Shmona Esrei standing with full concentration. That's the distinction between Shmona Esrei and Shema. Now, practically, this is a very, very important question because again, what the Mechaber tells us is that it is better to daven after Alos Shmona Esrei, after Alos, standing with kavana, than waiting till the right time for Shema and davening Shema and Shmona Esrei together, but without concentration. Now, as I pointed out here, the Mishnah Berurah in Sivkot Mem Beis says, "Rov ha'olam ein nisharim bazeh," that most of the people don't do this. Most people will wait, so they daven Shema and Shmona Esrei together, just whether it's sitting on their subway, whether it's sitting on the shuttle, whatever it is, at a time period where it's a little more difficult, but they would rather be somich geula litfila. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says. Many poskim, Rav Shechter has told me, Rav Shechter seems to paskin like the Shulchan Aruch, like the Mechaber, and therefore I get this question very, very often. What's better? I'm going on a subway, and it's going to take me, a half hour to get there, so I have a half hour on the subway. But the half hour is going to be after, let's just say Misha Yakir, but I'm not going to be able to stand up, right? You're sitting on the subway, or if you're standing, it's not going to be in a good way. So is it better for me to daven Shmona Esrei before and then daven, Shema then, or Shema at the right time, or to daven everything on the subway? So this is the machlokas that we're dealing with. The Mechaber says it's better to daven Shmona Esrei after Alos at home and daven Shema later at the right time. The Mishnah Berurah says many, many people will wait till they're on the subway and they can daven it together. Again, Rav Shechter is passing the first way, and that seems to be the simple understanding of the Gemara also. Again, a very, very important point. So practically what that means for doctors, let's say, is a person who wakes up, let's say, after Alos or right by Alos. So what should they do? So again, each situation is going to be different, but what one can do is, again, in a pressing situation, you would daven Shmona Esrei b'kavana, and then when you have time after the time starts, after Misha Yakir, you'll say Shmona Esrei, also b'kavana, also with the brachos. Right? That would be, again, if you had time to do both, it's ideal to do both Shema and Shmona Esrei together. But assuming that there isn't time to do both, for whatever reason, that would be a fair thing to do. Now, there was a question that was asked of me when I was asked to give this year about a shortened Shmona Esrei, what we call, many call Havinenu. So the Mishnah in Brachos on Chav Tes Amud Aleph tells us that there's a concept. Someone want to ask a question? No, okay. There's a concept the Mishnah has called something that's Me'ein Shmona Esrei, something like similar to Shmona Esrei. So the Gemara there on Amud Beis tells us there's a machlokas Rav and Shmuel what this means. So Shmuel says this means the tefillah that we call Havinenu, which is a tefillah the Gemara tells us, which basically what Havinenu is, you say the first three brachos of Shmona Esrei, and then you say this tefillah of Havinenu, which includes all the other in-between brachos, and then you say the last three. So it's a much more shortened Shmona Esrei, obviously, because they're really only 7 brachos. Now, this is a problem for example, on Motzei Shabbos, because there's no Havdalah. It's a problem in the winter months, because no, Mor Natal, all these problems that arise. But this is something that Shmuel says. Rav says, no, there's no such tefillah as Havinenu. You have to say all 18 brachos, but you can just make them shortened. Okay, so what's the halacha? So there's a big discussion in the Rishonim, but basically most of the Rishonim assume that b'shas hatchak, in a pressing situation, one is allowed to recite this tefillah of Havinenu. One is allowed to recite this shortened Shmona Esrei. So Tosos say that means if you're, baderech, if you're traveling and you can't say a full Shmona Esrei, just say the shortened Shmona Esrei. Rabbi Yonah says if you're worried someone's going to stop you in the middle of Shmona Esrei, so this happens a lot by doctors. If they think they're on call, theoretically, maybe they should say Havinenu, or meaning they're in the hospital, let's say, and they're waiting for their beeper to page them or something. The Rambam also comes and says you can say Havinenu when you're very tarod, and it's just okay. The Shulchan Aruch here passes on Siman Kuf Yod that b'shas adchak kuon shehu baderech o shaya omid b'makom shehu tarod v'yarei shayafsikuhu. So you're traveling, or you're worried someone's going to stop you, or you can't daven with proper kavana. So what you should say that this tefillah of Havinenu. That's what the Shulchan Aruch passes. The Biur Halacha says bizman hazeh we don't say the tefillah for whatever reason. The Biur Halacha brings, not for now. But he points out that we do not say this tefillah. It's interesting. The Aruch HaShulchan here in Seif Vav says we don't say it nowadays, but he points out that when it comes to soldiers, when it comes to chayalim, so he says it's min hanachon to teach them this because they're not going to have enough time at all. In the Gesher HaChaim, in Rabbi Michal Tukaczynski's Sefer Navelas in Chelik Aleph, in Parak Aleph, so he says also by Echola. I think in the Dirshu Mishnah Berurah, they even quote this on the side, that by Echola, by someone who's very sick, who doesn't have the ability to have proper kavanah for the entire Shemona Esrei, so they can also say Havinenu. The Chayadim Klal Chavdal disagrees with this. But even if you disagree, as the Mishnah Berurah and Sif Khan Vav points out, you can still shorten the brachos, shorten Shemona Esrei, and you can look in the Chayadim, he has a proper nusach. So practically, again, if someone is in a situation where they have, a minute and a half to daven Shemona Esrei, and that's the only time period they have through the entire Zman, so there's a serious question whether they should recite this tefillah of Havinenu or shorten Shemona Esrei. It's something that should be asked. It's a machlokas in the poskim whether one can or cannot. I'm not going to say whether one should or should not, but there are many poskim who say, again, if you really, really need to, if there's no other option, that it is kedai to say this bracha. I think, it used to be no one knew this tefillah of Havinenu, but I think like 15, 20 years ago or something, Art Scroll put it in their siddur, even less. And that's why now people know of the tefillah of Havinenu. Before that, no one knew of this tefillah. But now it's known. And so if you have I think most Art Scroll siddurs have it. So if you really need to, it seems like there would be a tenable solution if you have that minute and a half to be able to recite the tefillah of Shemona Esrei with Havinenu. Just something to consider. There
are modern poskim that matter it for doctors, not just for patients.
So it would be, again,
or soldiers.
Your Chiyam Michal Tukaczynski is talking about a chole, he's talking about a patient. The Aruch HaShulchan, for example, is talking about soldiers.
So doctor would be the same.
Presumably, yeah.
Okay.
But again, that's why you don't want to say it as a general psak, because it's very, very difficult to say that a doctor is going to have a minute and a half through his man and he won't have the 5 minutes or 4 minutes or 3 minutes, whatever. I'm just giving people a little more kavanah to recite Shemona Esrei properly. So it is very rare. So this point may be a little more theoretical. But it could be that someone, again, let's say who's in a surgeon, so they know they're going to have an 8-hour surgery. So in the middle of the surgery, they can take for some reason, they can take a short bathroom break. They can take literally a minute and a half bathroom break. So maybe then it would be kedai to recite the tefillah of Havinenu. According to some poskim, again, the Biur Halacha seems to not think it's okay. But there are modern poskim who would say that one can, yes. It's a big discussion also in the army. I think the IDF, when they come out with these halachos, so I think they quote maybe from Chacham Ovadia, who maybe was matir, or one of the poskim who was matir for the soldiers also nowadays to say Havinenu if they need to.
Even in the winter.
Even in the winter, they say. Yeah, that's again, I wasn't going to get too much into Havinenu, but even in the winter, yes. How you figure that out, okay, that's for a separate discussion, but yeah. Okay. So that's, again, we spoke about Kriya Shema, Berchos Kriya Shema, we spoke about Shemona Esrei. So what about Psuki de Zimra and Karbanos? So the Tur in the first Siman in Orach Chaim points out that Karbanos are meant to be said during the day. Now, the assumption here, and it's an important assumption, is that, I mean this a little bit sarcastically, but it's very important to say Karbanos every day. It's, according to some, it's the only Doraisa to say every day. So it's important to have it in our mind also. But the Torah in Orach Chaim Siman Aleph says that they should be said, that Karbanos should be said during the day. The Beis Yosef quotes that this from Chuvas HaRash, and this is how the Shulchan Aruch paskins in Seif Vav that one should say it only during the day. Now, both the Magen Avram and the Pri Megadim and others point out that there are certain ones that maybe you can say at night. But practically speaking, the Mishnah Berurah in Sif Katan Yud Zayin says, again, I put it right here, V'im ein lo pnai yachol omer gam parshas karbanos balayla. Mishnah Berurah says, no, worst comes to worst, if you don't have time, you can say it at night. Again, balayla means even before alos. Again, if you would need to. So that's Karbanos. What about Psuke de Zimra? So the poskim all quote from the Maharil. The Maharil writes in his Seder Tfilas Chag HaSukkos. See, there's this whole story that he brings, that a story on Hoshana Rabbah, that the Maharil said that everyone had to fast on Erev Mar Cheshvan, Erev Rosh Chodesh of Mar Cheshvan. I think that's when it was. Someone can fact check me if I'm wrong, but I think that's when it was. And he said for various sins, and one of the sins that he said is that because they daven Psuke de Zimra, before daytime, before alos hashachar. Now that comes from the Haril. That's what the poskim all quote. Now the Pri Megadim in Siman Tafresh Samech Dalid has a problem. This he doesn't fully understand what the problem is. The daven psuke de zimra before alos hashachar, and he kind of leaves it as an issue. Now, there are many tshuvas about this, but just to bring one, the Kloisenberger has a tshuva in a Divrei Yatziv in Orach Chaim in Siman Kuf Ches, where he discusses this question, and he thinks it's mutter to recite psuke de zimra before alos hashachar. One of the proofs he brings from, I think, the Maharsham, the Achronim already bring down, is this Rashi I quoted in Brachos and Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis. You can take a look. Just do the press time. I'm not going to read through the Rashi, but this is one of the proofs that he brings, that one is allowed to recite Psuke de Zimra before the day begins, i.e. before Alos. He thinks it may be dependent on what the nature of Psuke de Zimra is. Is Psuke de Zimra kind of its own tefillah, or is it meant to be a preparation for shachris? One of the big nafkaminos is, let's say someone doesn't say, they came to shul late and they came at Baruch. So they're really supposed to recite Baruch and daven the rest of tefillah with the tzibor. Now, after davening, do they go back and say Psuke de Zimra? So the question is Psuke de Zimra, was it a preparation for tefillah? You already davened. Or is it really its own thing that you're supposed to say, its own shevach that you're supposed to say, in which case you would recite it even after shachris? So he thinks that that question may be relevant to our question of whether you can recite Psuke de Zimra before day. If it's just a preparation, then you can recite it before day begins, before alos. But if it has its own status of like a tefillah, then you should wait till the day begins. But practically, he thinks, again, practically, that you can recite Psuke de Zimra even before alos, even before daybreak. So now, again, practically, just to put these together, then we'll spend maybe 3 more minutes, but just to put these things together. So again, a person wakes up very, very early because he has to go work. He has to go do the mitzvah, be associated with the mitzvah of pikuach nefesh. So before alos begins, one presumably is allowed to recite both karbanos and psuke de zimra. That seems to be clear. Now, in a pressing situation, so one is allowed to recite shmona esrei before alos. Now, according to many pressing situations, you're even allowed to recite kriya shema before, not before alos, sorry, before Misha Yakir. I apologize, after alos. For Kriya Shema in a pressing situation, you would also be allowed. Now, there may be a difference in what a shas adchak, what a pressing situation is between Kriya Shema and Tefillah. However, if you're really in a pressing situation because you need to go to the hospital to save lives, according to many poskim, that's considered a serious shas adchak, and therefore even Kriya Shema you would be allowed to say before alos. So that means, again, you would wake up even before alos, you can say psuke de zimra, you can say karbanos. After alos, potentially, you can say kriya shema and shmona esrei, and you can almost always say shmona esrei if, again, it's a shas adchak. If it's not such a serious shas adchak, you can say shmona esrei, or you only have 5 minutes. So you say shmona esrei after alos, and then you can say kriya shema at some point when the zman hits after Misha Yakir, because you really just need to have kavana, again, for the first pasuk or first paragraph, but not for such a long time period. So that's all, again, in terms of the davening proper. For at least for men, okay, so that's at least for men. For women, so they have a much, because their chiyuv and tefillah is much different, so practically, without getting into too much of the particulars, so if you have a woman who's going to wake up in the same pressing situation, so they should make sure, first and foremost, to say Berachos HaShachar, and they should also make sure to say Shmona Esrei, because their tefillah presumably can be mikuyam, can be fulfilled by just saying that. They don't need to say the Kriya Shema necessarily. Now, they should say it at a later point if they can, but their calculation is just a little bit different in terms of that. That's just something to keep in mind. Now, that's all in terms of tefillah. Just in terms of tallis and tefillin, so because I just don't want to not say anything about this. So again, the when it comes to tallis, so the zman of tallis, as the Rambam in the 3rd paragraph of Tzitzis tells us, is the zman of Misha Yakir. Again, that time period where in between alos and Netzach Hama, the time period that you can recognize a familiar face 4 amos away. Again, just look on your app when that is. But that time period, that's when there's a mitzvah of tzitzis, meaning you can't make a bracha beforehand. Now, the Mordechai in Megillah tells us that even from alos hashachar, one would theoretically be allowed to make a bracha on their tallis, on their tzitzis. So this is, again, the Mechaber and the Ramah here in Siman Yud Ches and Siv Gimel brings out both of these. So the Mechaber says you have to make it only Misha Yakir. And then he says, Yeshom Demivarich Alav, even after Alos. And that's, again, the Mordechai. So what happened? Okay, so that's practically, again, if you're in a pressing situation, you can put on your tallis even from Alos HaShachar, make a bracha. Now, what happens if you woke up even beforehand? Can you put on your tallis? So again, it's the Ramah at the end of this line here in Yirches and Gimel from the Tashbetz, that if you put on, let's say, your tallis before Alos HaShachar, you can put it on, you shouldn't make a bracha, and then once Alos hits, or really once Misha Yakir hits, if you still have it on, so you can just move it and make a bracha. You can just play with your tzitzis. It's a discussion whether you need to do more in the poskim, but that's presumably all you need to do. The reason being, again, the bracha is meant to be a bracha that has to be over l'asiyas, and you make a bracha before you do the mitzvah. The entire time you're wearing the tallis, you're doing the mitzvah. So if you're still wearing it, you can still make a bracha because it's before you're doing the mitzvah, because right after you make the bracha, you're going to be doing the mitzvah. Okay. Now, what about tefillin? So the Gemara in Brachos and Daf Tes tells us that tefillin is also this man as Misha Yakir. But the Mishnah Berurah says, as I point here in Pei Tes and Sifkat Mem, it's also in Simon Pei Tes, in Sifkat and Aleph and Dalet, it comes in a few places. So really the same thing. You can put on your tefillin already from Alos HaShachar, maybe even before. But in terms of making a bracha, you should wait ideally until Misha Yakir. So, again, just time press, so I don't want to speak too much. Rav Moshe has a big tshuva about this in Orach Chaim, in Chelek Aleph, about tefillin, he thinks you can even make a bracha on tefillin in the middle of the night. Now, practically, that sometimes is used. If you would ask a rabbi the question, practically, sometimes they'll use Rav Moshe and say, you can put it on even before Alos with a bracha. Okay, so that's an important Makom to know. But in terms of our situation, if a person wakes up in a general situation, you wake up before Alos, you can put on your tallis and tefillin. You say Psukei de Zimra, you say Karbanos. Good. Now, you wait till Alos at least to say Shemona Esrei. And in our situations, very often, you can also say Shema and Shemona Esrei if it's a really pressing situation. Before you hit, after Yishtabach, before you hit Yotzer Or, you should try to time it that it's a time period that you can make the bracha on your tallis and tefillin. When you make the bracha on your tallis and tefillin, while they're still on, you can just move them. So you play with your tzitzis fringes, and you move your head a little bit, and you just make the bracha in both situations, and that would work according to everyone. Again, to make the bracha, you should try to wait to Misha Yakir for both of them. Again, I'm sorry that was all a little quick. I was trying to get, the whole thing, or all of that as much as possible. Just to end off, just again, one more minute. For doctors, Hilchos Tefillah is very, very important. It's very, very easy to become desensitized to tefillah once you begin ready for medical school rotations and then residency, etc. The litmus test is always when you're not working, and you're still, coming to shul late, or you're doing, and obviously it's very difficult when for a month you're on a surgery rotation, let's say, or you're a surgical resident, so you have a whole year of it, and whatever the residency is. And you have to daven b'yichidos, you have to daven at the wrong times, and you really have to be conscious of this so that when you're not in those situations, you can go back to the lechatchilas. As we mentioned before, often a shas atchak says you daven at the wrong time, and that's lechatchila, but oftentimes it's not. And we have to have the perspective of how significant tefillah is. Maybe just one point. The Gemara in Shabbos tells us that that if someone goes to do bikur cholim, so they make some bracha. That the person should be get healed b'soch shar cholei Yisrael, amongst all the sick people in the Jewish nation. And Rabbi says, la'olam l'shatef inish nafshei b'hadei tzibura, that whenever you're davening for someone, so you should partner him with the whole tzibur. Meaning, we always say b'soch shar cholei Yisrael. We always say me amongst all the other people. The entire Shemona Esrei is not a lashon of yechidim, of us. It's Rabbim. It's all about us, all of us, right? Atachoni ladam daz, chaninu meitcha, right? All these ones, hashivenu avinu l'sarasacha, right? Bring us. It's all about us. And when we think of tefillah, it's not really just for us; it's for other people. Perhaps that's a perspective that can help us in terms of, in the time periods when it's a little harder because we're so used to davening at these off, davening quickly, davening a little bit differently. But when we have time period to do it, think about, my tefillah is not just for me, but it's for other people, and especially nowadays, that's something very, very important. Okay, sorry I went a little over, but those were quickly, very, very quickly, a lot of these inyanim that many doctors deal with.